All righty, guys. Well, welcome back. Gabrielle, how we doing?
Doing pretty well.
Good. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try not to butcher your name, but Gabriella Antonioli. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was really good.
Awesome. Well, Gabrielle is joining us from the Bridger-Teton Forecast Center up in Jackson, Wyoming. And I'm super excited to hear her talk on forecasting for wet avalanches. So take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll have to set it to the right. Tell me if it's not set to the right size for this as well. Oh no. Now you can see my
presenter view.
All right. I'll just play it. Good?
Great.
Awesome. Thanks. I still, after all these years, I still am not used to Zoom. It's always just brutal. But my name is Gabrielle, and I forecast for the Bridger-Teton Avalanche Center right now. And in the spring, I go up and forecast for a road in Northwest Montana known as the Going to the Sun Road. And it's really, really interesting forecasting. It's a lot of wet snow issues, and it's usually forecasting when everyone has kind of put their skis away. So you kind of get a glimpse at some really different snow dynamics. So first and foremost, I kind of want to thank my coworkers. Let me minimize myself. This team is super awesome, and I'm really fortunate to work with these guys. Eric Peich is of the USGS and Zachary Miller is of the USGS. It's a joint forecasting partnership between the National Park Service and the USGS. So there are two USGS forecasters and two National Park Service forecasters, myself, and then John Hagnes, who also does snow safety at Big Sky. So the purpose of this is I'm kind of just going to provide an overview of our last season up on the road. I'm going to kind of get into how we even forecast wet snow problems there, and then kind of highlight the gaps in current research and progress being made with regards to our wet snow knowledge, because there is just a huge deficit. Dry snow is obviously a lot more fun to be in, and so in that regard, there's a lot more research to do with it as well. So this is Joe. He's on the road crew. That we work really closely with the roads crew up there, and I'll let him kind of explain why what he's doing up there and why our forecasting is so important, and it is this very like trusting relationship with this group of plow workers. So I'll let him explain what he does.
So you have your road profile on the hillside like this. As long as you have ground or dirt here to support your snow activities, you're good with the machine. But once you start pushing out and building up a large area of snow, that snow can slide off. So right here, we're going to have to cut it all down and push it back to the rotary. And the rotary is going to have to launch it off and over the hill. That's what goes on. It might seem kind of already doing it this way, but the whole idea that they're doing it this way is because they cannot get out on the snow. Because if they get out on the snow with the machines, the possibility of the snow breaking loose, and that's what happened a few years ago when the machine broke.
And let me know if the audio is bad on this too. I don't know how this goes over Zoom. So that is kind of basically what the crew is doing in machinery while we're out there. We put out a daily forecast internally to the National Park Service that we write. It's pretty much your standard forecast, other than our hazard scale is a little different. There's no considerable. So there's like low hazard, moderate, and then high. And if it's high, no one can be up on the road but us. And usually we're just checking on conditions. And under moderate hazard, Essentially a D2 avalanche can hit the road, like up to a D2 can hit the road, and they can be out there working, and we're out there skinning above them in the paths, spotting them and watching them. But this is kind of the basic anatomy of the road. And I think I can have a pointer. So it's, as you can see, the blue triangles represent major avalanche zones. And as you work higher on the road, it just becomes path after path after path. And it's really hard to see how big these paths are. A lot of them produce D4 avalanches. So the top of this garden wall here, this is the Continental Divide. That's about at like 9,000 feet. And the road is bisecting all these paths at around 6,000 feet. And then a lot of them will run all the way down to Logan Creek, which is down at like 3,500 feet. So we're talking like in total, you know, like 5,000 to 6,000 feet of relief that this road is bisecting in the middle of all these paths. So it's really interesting terrain to forecast in. Also, all of this faces west-southwest, which is really great when you're forecasting what snow avalanches, because you're just getting all of the solar input, right? So this is kind of what that looks like. This is me on Oberlin spotting some plow crew along the road here. And it's kind of the only safe spot as this year. You know, usually we can climb above them a little ways, but this is called the slopes, and it just sheds snow continually. So it's quite hard to be a skier and be in a safe spot there for spotting. So we can like skin along the road. Logan Pass is here, and then climb this mountain, and we can see all the crew, and then we can see what's happening with the snow above them. This is a particularly nasty path called Triple Arches. As you can see, it's just fed by a ton of terrain and a lot of different aspects there. So that one's pretty nasty. Here's another view of it.
I think it might be kind of tricky to cross.
Yeah. So that was in May of this year, and this is it in May of last year. And when we talk about like forecasting loose, wet avalanches, I feel like skiers usually have this perspective of a loose, wet avalanche being like small and slow and controlled. And this is May of last year, that same path, what the loose, wet avalanches look like on the road. I love that guy with the should reboot every time. But this is what these paths are capable of producing, and added to this hazard is the fact that bikers, as soon as we're off the road, bikers want to like make it up to the last place that we plowed. And so this year we had kind of control over where the hiker biker closure was, which was the first year that we've had that ability to converse with the rangers and control that, because they don't obviously want tourists on bicycles being hit by avalanches, which there is about 13 bicyclists stuck on the uphill side of that avalanche path after this avalanche happened, and it ended in like a rescue of having to get people back across. So they want to avoid that. But it's phenomenally beautiful terrain to be around and ski around in. This is kind of what a lot of that off the road looks like. But it's also just absurdly hazardous as a forecaster. It's really interesting because we're essentially forced into the terrain that the road crew is in. And depending on the conditions, that can be pretty hazardous for us. That's pretty much ski cramponing from the truck, usually up something really steep. And it's just, you know, a fall in this terrain as a forecaster would be really unforgiving. And here's Zach and John kind of working their way up Haystack. Another view of what some of the paths look like. And then there's Zach and John going up to a glide crack above the road. But it's also really interesting. It has a large historical database, essentially, of road conditions, which can be really useful as a forecaster. Herb is the D4 driver, and he keeps daily journals of the road conditions dating back into the 90s, which is really useful because you can tell him the weather that day and how far we're up on the road, and he'll like nod his head and be like, yeah, that's just like 2011. We're right on right on cue for being timed like that. And usually his predictions are pretty good, and that's actually really helpful as a forecaster. There's also a lot of bears coming out of dens, so that's an added objective hazard. Just kind of grizzly bears wandering around everywhere. Then we have glide cracks above the road as well that form in pretty usual spots depending on the season. Sometimes they just melt out, and sometimes they release and hit the road, and it kind of depends on how the snowpack stacks up that season. This is just in there because that's what a bear den looks like, which was like shocked. We ski this ridgeline a lot, and then one day we showed up and there's just a hole in it and mama and baby bear tracks coming out of that. So lots of bear den. We have a ton of weather station data, which is really useful. We rely a lot on this Garden Wall weather station, which is at 7,400 feet. Logan Pass is usually down all winter, and we can get it back up and running as long as we get high enough on the road, we can skin to it. And that's also really useful because that will help us forecast for the east side, and weather can be just entirely different being on the continental divide between the west and east side. So having those two is pretty key. But has all its usual things. It does long and short wave as well to kind of help us with cloud cover with radiation. But this past winter and spring, as a lot of us know, the snow lasted really late. And so this was May 26th, that watch station. Which was not particularly springy feeling. Really interesting season to be up on the road because we essentially had 3 peak sweeps. The first was April 10th, and then the next was May 10th, and then May 20th. And it was really interesting because it would heat up and then we would get this really large loading event of 1 or 2 or 3 feet of snow. So that really affected how water was moving through the snowpack there and running off the road. And that's kind of what that looked like late May, which was also really cool. And made the forecasting quite a bit different than previous years. So this is a graph of the types of avalanches that hit the road. We have about 90 avalanches that hit the road, 70 of which affected it. And as you can see, most of them are wet loose avalanches. And here's our corresponding ratings for each day. We only, we had a lot less high than we usually do just because of the cooler temperatures. But those high hazard days and ratings overlap with when we got loading events generally, or when it got really warm after those loading events. So yeah, we had 73 greater than D1 avalanches hit the road in an 8-week period, which is a lot of avalanches. But luckily none of the road was hurt. They didn't have to repair any of it, I guess hurt as a road. But usually, it can take out parts of the road. So we were fortunate this season that didn't happen. As I was saying, just a lot less wet loose activity. And again, this was a repeater path kind of low down that surprised us, that had this massive 40-foot debris pile that we plowed through. And then we had a little bit of snow, and the next day it had essentially refilled back in. So some different dynamics were happening this season as far as staying cooler and having more dry snowfall. So this is kind of the root of my presentation, is that can we forecast wet snow problems? Because they operate by a lot different physical dynamics that are a lot harder for us to identify as forecasters. I would say yes, but there's just this really huge gap in our understanding of like wet snow after it's from that dry to wet transition phase. Like we study it all up until that phase of where it's transitioned and kind of like locked up. And then after that, we don't really know meteorologically like how the weather and how the snowpack are changing over time. And thus it's really hard to forecast and understand what problems are happening in it. And then if you're me, you like Google wet snow forecasting going into your forecasting job. And what comes up is, if it's above freezing, if there's deep boot pen, if there's cloudy skies, rain, or intense solar, like it's not safe. Don't go out. And you're like, that's a Tuesday on the road. So how do you manage that? How do you account for that uncertainty? And like, as far as mindsets as a mitigator go, there's one suggestion, right, of spring diurnal, which is like watch for overnight refreeze. But what if that's not happening and you still have to go up there and work in that environment? And, you know, being in an environment where D2 avalanches are actively happening and you as a skier have to be able to find your way around them, as well as like watch out for the safety of a road crew. But interestingly, he wrote a really good article updating that we should kind of keep the conversation going on mitigators' mindsets and kind of evolving that, and made me think, oh, maybe we should be the ones that are coming up with this sort of like wet snowpack mitigation guidelines. So to start, especially with like when wet slabs come into play, we, like any dry snow forecaster, we want snowpack structure data and we want met data. We want the location of the problem, and we want a mitigation plan. Like if we close the road, for how long? So with data, particularly if we have a wet slab season, we want to know the snowpack history, if that wet slab recipe is present, and then we want to watch it as it transitions past that wet to dry phase. This season, we didn't have a wet slab recipe, unfortunately. There was like a really big AR event early March, and that caused a huge avalanche cycle, but essentially made the lower half of the pack just like a brick of concrete. So it didn't have any prominent weak layers by the time we arrived in April. And again, we want to combine that with our Met station data. And we use a lot of like short and long-term model prediction, especially with clouds, because they really impact a lot. This is one I really like, the href. It's a synoptic cloud cover model that I find really useful and is not wrong some of the time. And again, those challenges of location on the continental divide. So being able to kind of look at vorticity and vertical velocity and infer weather patterns from that. So again, this is kind of what that structure looked like. It's essentially melt freeze frost by the time we came. Usually there's some more prominent facet layers there that we dig some early season pits that are just brutal to dig in the snow, but we can really infer a lot of what's being preserved as a weak layer in there still, and what might go if we get a ton of solar input primarily. We want to know the location. So this was propagating results in a pit after some of that new snowfall. And so we want to know like where this is such a short-lived problem, but we kept pretty close tabs on it because the wet slab recipe was actually setting up again to happen because we were getting so much more dry snowfall with clearings in between that we thought, oh, maybe there'll be a wet slab cycle on this top snow, but that didn't end up happening. We also have like interesting, you know, if it blows dust anywhere, anything darker heats up a lot faster and will shed a lot faster. And that was really interesting to watch this layer here that was buried. So this is all dry snow on top. And then this fifth layer here was just snow that had dust on it that was getting greater solar input and just totally like slush while the top was dry. It was becoming quite unstable faster than in other areas. So we would watch where this layer was. Then we kind of make a plan, like, do we close the road and for how long? And that can be really challenging because even after peak solar has passed, water is definitely moving in that snowpack for a long time after that. And it's sometimes, you know, you kind of have to stop yourself from having a knee-jerk dry snow reaction of like, oh, it's peak solar today, like hottest day of the week, like everything is going to go now. And you'll go up there and forecast and nothing will happen. And then the next day will be slightly cooler and everything will start avalanching. And you're kind of like, great. You know, you kind of have to be open to these new patterns that we're not used to seeing as much. Another example is this glide crack. We have this geoprevent camera aimed at this glide crack right here. And it's really helpful. We can watch it grow. We send the photos to Switzerland and they do pixel deformation analysis and send it back to us. We can tell areas of the snow that are deforming at a higher rate. And so this was that at, the hottest point of the day. And then at 10 p.m. it avalanches. So just those trends are really interesting, and how long it takes water to permeate into the snowpack and start things moving is often just kind of like a confusing thing to wrap your head around at the beginning of a season. So my personal takeaways were that, again, even if peak radiation is passed, water is still moving in that snowpack. Like water would be pouring down the road every day for days. And it was funny to try to correlate it with days where there'd be more water. You'd expect there to be more activity, and they just don't align with that like that. They don't align necessarily with like a lysimeter reading. So just being able to tie that structure of that season to what's happening with the weather and how long that will take is pretty nuanced, but possible. And then cloud cover is probably the hardest thing to forecast, I think. But really important if it's keeping that radiation in. It's huge. Historical data is useful, but should be used with caution, because we live in a non-stationary world, and factors of the weather are changing and factors of the snowpack are changing. And I think this trend is, the importance of this work is that we might see more wet snow problems in areas like ski areas earlier and earlier. And we might have to deal with these problems or know what's going to happen when we get larger rain events, or we get hotter springs where melt off is a lot different. Knowing how to interpret your weather station data as the season progresses was a huge one as well for me. Like, it's very easy to look at a weather station midwinter, I feel like, and be like, oh, it's, cold. As long as it's below 32, you're like, oh, things seem great. It's not that nuanced, but in the spring, it's incredibly nuanced. Like, it has more to do with cloud cover, like the number of days that I would look at the weather station and it would say, 29 to 27 degrees. And I'd be like, great. It refroze, and you go up there and you step out of the truck and it's just mush. And then there would be days where, it'd be reading 38 and you're like, oh, I'm going to go up there and things are going to just be peeling off already. And it refroze. So there's a lot more complicated dynamics going on than just that air temperature happening. And then the biggest part is understanding the uncertainty within each specific snowpack that we forecast for, and building margins, whether we're forecasting in for the public in a ski area or for a road crew. We really have to be aware of how big we want that margin to be, especially with something less known like wet snow. Like that equipment will break down in the middle of an avalanche path, like a shear pin on a rotary plow will break, and Joe will be out there like fixing the rotary plow for an hour in the middle of an avalanche path. And you really want your margin to be big enough for your forecast that day that that's okay for him to do. It's not ideal, but if they have to fix equipment or do that's built into your margin as a forecaster. And then the not approved by the National Park Service wet snow acronym that John and I made up one morning, because snow professionals love acronyms, is WUTANG. If it's wet, unconsolidated, if there's terrain, yes, I know it's reaching, aspect, not refrozen, and glide avalanches are happening, then you're going to have wet snow problems. So WUTANG is very easy to remember. And we also developed some unique snowpack tests, to check for how much snow could be entrained, because that's also pretty important, like seeing how much mass of snow was wet and warm and could be moved. It dictates a lot of how far a lot of, the smaller avalanches will actually get going and hit the road. And so this is the plow berm test.
Yeah.
The classic. So So continuing research, there is a lot of progress with wet snow research. MSU student is examining snowpack properties post transition to wet snowpack. So he's going to be looking at all these properties regardless of, you know, whether there's weak layers or whatever. He's just going to look at that transition over time. There's also interesting research on doing PSTs on wet snow and measuring cut length changes on weaknesses there. Again, that exploration of that diurnal swing of temperatures with free water present is really interesting. We're going to continue to do some LiDAR work, which I'll show a picture of next up on the road, of LiDAR scanning glide cracks and using that GeoPrevent camera. And then we also have used UAVs to map the snowed up changes in the start zone, especially for some of the glide cracks, again, because they're hard to get to in some locations. And we scan this glide crack. We scanned some above the road, but this is the Heavens Peak Remnant Glacier glide crack, which is really hard to put to scale as well. But that glide crack crown is 13 meters deep. So pretty neat to be able to see that kind of stuff from afar. Use that technology. And then you can take a picture of this if you want to look up any cool research papers on wet snow. A lot of it is concentrated either in Europe or up on the Going in the Sun Road, but really interesting stuff. And then that bottom website is to the USGS website where Eric and Zach work. And again, I'd like to thank them because they're an awesome team. And that's it.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Really appreciate it. Do we have any questions here in the room? All right, I think you're getting off easy here. Anything in the chat, Rachel? I've got one here for you. After spending so much more time working in forecasting for wet problems than most avalanche forecasters, are there any blind spots that you can relate to those who spend less time in these conditions?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, again, looking at that temperature, especially if we're going out like skiing in the spring, that, you know, obviously the temperature thing is a lot more complicated. So I think looking at cloud cover and kind of looking at long wave radiation being kept in the spring if you're going out more is a huge, you know, counterpart to just looking at weather station data. Yeah, I don't know. And I guess the presumption that, you know, wet loose avalanches are slow moving or maybe more controllable than dry snow avalanches. I think that's kind of something that we think, and you know, it really depends, but a lot of the time it's not that way as well. I think these things can be pretty unpredictable in the same way dry snow can be. And I think, yeah, I mean, at least I can only speak from my own perspective, but going into it, you're like, oh, this is you know, these are maybe easier problems to manage, but in reality, they're just kind of different, right? They're just on this sort of more obscure spectrum of snow. So I don't know if that answers that question.
No, absolutely. I think that's a good point. I think in my experience, the unpredictability of, or sort of the inconsistent predictability of wet snow is challenging. But then also a lot of times they tend to be very destructive, kind of like Mike showed from the backside of Mammoth, or some of the things I've seen up on Mount Hood. They can, when they go big, they go real big. So.
Yeah, totally.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and hope you guys are having some good fun snow up there in Jackson.
Yeah, we are. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.